Welcome to the third annual Needleman Lecture from the UCSF Division of Occupational and Environmental Medicine. I am Mark Miller from the Western States Pediatric Environmental Health Specialty Unit, or PACU, which co-sponsors this series along with the Program on Reproductive Health in the Environment and the UCSF Environmental Research and Translations Health Center. The PACU is housed here at UCSF in the Occupational Medicine Division and is part of a national network funded by ATSDR and the US EPA. Our program develops educational materials for clinicians and the public and supports clinicians and public health professionals to address environmental health-related questions in children and during pregnancy. Herb Needleman was a pediatrician and child psychiatrist at the University of Pittsburgh Medical Center. He was a distinguished researcher who, having determined the developmental implications of low-level exposure to lead, worked tirelessly and at great personal cost to force governments and industry to confront the implications of his findings. He was the target of frequent attacks from industry, but fought off his critics with courage, tenacity, and dignity. He was exonerated of charges of scientific fraud and misconduct and won the right for those accused of such charges to an open hearing with legal representation. In the 1970s and 80s, Dr. Needleman's studies provided the first clear evidence that lead, even at low levels, could affect a child's IQ. He later determined that lead poisoning had long-term implications for a child's attentiveness, behavior, and school success. Dr. Needleman's work was instrumental in the EPA's decision to mandate the removal of lead from gasoline and by the Consumer Product Safety Commission to ban lead from interior paints. Herb gave the following advice to young investigators: do not avoid difficult areas of investigation. Take risks. If scientists exclusively choose the safe routes, avoid controversial research problems, and play only minor variations on someone else's themes, they voluntarily turn themselves into technicians, and our craft will indeed be in peril. Brenda Eskenazi, a long-term leader and innovator in the field of children's environmental health, directs the Center for Environmental Research and Community Health in the School of Public Health at the University of California at Berkeley. She is the distinguished Jennifer and Brian Maxwell Professor Emeritus of Maternal and Child Health and Epidemiology. Her training is as a neuropsychologist and epidemiologist, and her work examines the potential health effects of numerous toxicants, including pesticides, flame retardants, plasticizers, and air pollution, to name a few. She has a community-based participatory research focus, and in particular, she has been instrumental in illustrating the health conditions of farm worker families through the long-standing Chamacos Project. Dr. Eskenazi was awarded the prestigious Goldsmith Award from the International Society of Environmental Epidemiology for lifetime achievement. She is a leader and founding member in the International Society for Children's Health and the Environment, and actively involved there and elsewhere in addressing climate change. It is our pleasure to introduce you to Brenda Eskenazi.
Hi, all. Thank you. Good morning. Today, I'm going to be talking about some of the lessons that we've learned working in the fields of the Salinas Valley. Our study has been going on for about 25 years, and I have no disclosures. So Mark gave an introduction about Herb Needleman. Let me just tell you my own personal story about Herb Needleman. I was trained as a neuropsychologist doing clinical work and got thrown into an environmental disaster in Michigan and realized that my whole world had changed because I no longer wanted to be a neuropsychologist. I wanted to do what the people were doing in Michigan with Irving Selikoff's group. I wanted to change into environmental health. I had the good fortune of speaking to Herb Needleman about 2 weeks before this paper was published. He wouldn't tell me the results, by the way, of the paper because it was going to be published in the New England Journal. I went to Boston to talk to him, and he told me what I needed to do to become what he was, or try to become what he was, doing what he did. He took the time and the energy to mentor me, and so I have a personal admiration for Herb Needleman all my life, for becoming who I am today. So thank you, Herb, and thank you for this honor to respect him. So today I'm going to be talking about agriculture and farm worker health. And agriculture in the United States is a big ticket item. We bring in a lot of money because of farm production, but we also use a ton of pesticides, actually 1 billion pounds of pesticides. Most of the farm workers in the United States are immigrants. Most are born in Mexico and have relatively low education level. California is the leading agricultural state in the United States. We produce about 50% of fruits, nuts, and vegetables, and we use a lot of pesticides. I'm going to be focusing on this valley right here. Everyone thinks about the Central Valley when they think of agriculture, but the Salinas Valley is unique in that it's smaller than the Central Valley, but actually is more concentrated in terms of its use of pesticides. The Salinas Valley is called the salad bowl of the nation. We supply most of the head crops to the United States. At the time that we did our study, about 500,000 pounds of a particular class of pesticides, organophosphate pesticides, were used annually in the Salinas Valley. Most of the farm workers had immigrated from Mexico. In 1998, there was a call for research from the US EPA and the NIH to establish centers of children's environmental health. We were fortunate to be awarded that center. When we were thinking about what would be the focus of our center, we said, hey, California is the leading agricultural state in the United States. We know virtually nothing about low levels of pesticide exposure and child health. I think we need to do this. And so we decided to start the Center for the Health Assessment of Mothers and Children of Salinas, or the Chamacos study. Chamacos means kids in Mexican Spanish. And we started 25 years ago. The objectives of Chamacos were to measure pregnant women and children's exposure to pesticides, as well as other environmental chemicals of people living in the Salinas Valley. We determined the relationship of these exposures with maternal and child health, but most importantly, we aim to reduce children's exposure to these chemicals through intervention and education in the community. In 1999 to 2000, by the way, I can't see the top of my screen. I can't move this, so I can move this. Okay. In 1999 to 2000, we enrolled about 600 pregnant women from clinics serving farm workers. This was mostly Natividad Hospital and Clínica de Salud de Valle de Salinas. We didn't specifically recruit farm workers, but we worked with the clinics that work primarily with farm workers. 92% of the women we enrolled were Spanish speaking. Almost all were born in Mexico. About half had lived in the United States for less than 5 years. We never asked about documentation status, but based on the amnesty laws, we estimate that at least 50 to 75% of our population was undocumented at the time that we recruited them into the study. Most were living within 200% of poverty, which is important because at the time that we did the study, the only way that we could get a window into the health of the farm worker population was pretty much during pregnancy, because it was during that time that farm workers, even if they were undocumented, had entry into Medi-Cal. So all of our women were Medi-Cal eligible. Even if the woman themselves was not a farm worker, about 44% worked in agriculture during pregnancy, they usually lived with a farm worker. So almost all of the families were farm working families. Okay. Since then, we followed the mothers and children about every year or two, and you can see along this timeline how often we followed each of the families. And then at age 9, we added a second cohort. These were 9-year-olds that were born in the same years as the original cohort was born. So they had the same entry criteria. And then from that point forward, we followed all of the children in Chamacos 1 as well as in Chamacos 2. The children are now 22 years old. We have evaluated the health and development of the children, the youth, and the mothers at each visit. We interviewed the mothers and the teachers. We tested and did neuropsychological evaluations of the children. We determined when they entered puberty through Tanner staging. We measured anthropometry, liver transaminases, and metabolic disorder. We evaluated their respiratory function. We have assessed brain function. We have collected data on risk-taking behaviors. And right now we're beginning a study to perform MRIs on the mothers. We have collected a ton of biological and environmental samples to measure pesticides and other chemicals, but also to look at other health outcomes. We've collected urine, blood, breast milk, saliva, hair, teeth, house dust. We have stored over 400,000 biological and environmental samples that are frozen at -80. We have also done geospatial analyses. We have collected data on every residence that the mother and child lived in since the time the mother was pregnant. And with those residence information, we can geocode using the pesticide use reporting data reported by the state. We can look at pesticide use within 1 kilometer of those residences. We have also used this geospatial analyses that Steph Home has done a beautiful job of looking at PM 2.5 in relationship to those residences. Agricultural pesticide use in Monterey County is shown on this slide. And as you can see, since the time we started the study, there have been increases and decreases of different pesticides. In the red is organophosphates, and I'm going to be talking mostly about organophosphates. And you can see from the time that we started our study, there has been a marked decrease. But if you look at the yellow line, the yellow area right below it, that's glyphosate, and there has been an increase in the use of glyphosate. So our initial focus was on organophosphate pesticides. At the time that we did the study, about 35% of the insecticides used in California were organophosphate pesticides. And for example, chlorpyrifos, diazinon, oxydimeton methyl, malathion are all organophosphate pesticides. Up until 2001, organophosphates were allowed to be used in homes. And in 2001, chlorpyrifos and diazinon were restricted for home use. However, they still remain used in agriculture up until recently. The way that organophosphates work is that they depress acetylcholinesterase. They affect the nervous system of insects, but at high doses, they were well known to poison humans, whether it's farm workers or children that accidentally ingest it. There are other mechanisms that we now know how organophosphates at lower doses work. Organophosphate pesticides, or OPs, are eliminated in urine as dialkyl phosphate metabolites, or DAPs. And I'm going to be referring to those metabolites because that's what we measured in the mothers and in the children. We found that those DAPs, or the dialkyl phosphate metabolites, or DAPs, were higher in the pregnant women than in the women in the United States. Fortunately for us, the same lab that analyzed our Tumaco samples, which was the CDC, also analyzed the samples for the general US population through the Ann Haynes study. Asa Bradman in the lower left-hand corner is now at UC Merced, led these studies and showed that our Chumacos women did indeed have higher levels of exposure than the general US population. We also worked with CDC to develop a way of measuring organophosphates in breast milk. There had before at that point no way of measuring it in breast milk. Organochlorines, yes, but not organophosphates. And we found that in 97% of the breast milk samples, there were measurable levels of organophosphates. We also found that in nearly all of the house dust samples that we collected, there were residues of organophosphates. Asa did a study with us where he looked at, this is in children, we gave a bunch of children organic food and conventional food, trying to understand where those DAPs were coming from. Was it from food, or was it from living in the Salinas Valley that made people in the mothers have higher levels, the children have higher levels than the general US population? So we set out to do a study, a very expensive study, by giving food to a population. And we showed that those who had conventional diet, meaning with pesticides compared to organic, whether they lived in Oakland or lived in Salinas, an agricultural community, those who were given conventional had higher levels of those dialkyl phosphate, the DAPs, than those who were given organic food. But if you look at this a slightly different way, regardless of whether they ate conventional or organic, those who lived in Salinas, an agricultural area, had higher levels than those who lived in an urban area, Oakland. So it showed that by food and living near agriculture, we are getting exposed to those OPs and they're metabolized into DAPs. Those higher levels of organophosphate DAPs in the mothers during pregnancy were associated with shorter pregnancies, abnormal reflexes in the newborns, poorer verbal abilities in preschool children, problems of attention at age 5, poorer social skills at age 7, poorer executive function at age 12, poorer working memory at age 12, and traits similar to autism at age 2 and at age 14 years. We did not find associations of DAPs with childhood exposure and neurodevelopment. I'm now going to focus on one particular outcome because it's going to come back multiple times during my talk. One of the studies that we did showed that those dialkyl phosphate metabolites in the mother during pregnancy were related to decreased Wechsler Intelligence Scale scores in the children, IQ scores, 7 years later. And that was across the board in all of those different subscales, whether you look at working memory, processing speed, verbal comprehension, perceptual reasoning. You can see that all of the beta coefficients and confidence intervals fall below the no effect line. And overall, you see about a 6-point drop in full scale IQ with each 10-fold increase of the DAPs during the mother's pregnancy. To look at it slightly different, if we divide the mothers into 3 groups based on having low, moderate, or high tertiles of those DAPs during pregnancy, if you look at the women who had the lowest DAP levels, meaning the lowest exposure, presumably, and those that had the highest, you see about a 7 IQ point difference in the children 7 years later, and that's about half a standard deviation. I'm going to come back to that result over and over again, so keep in mind that 7 IQ point difference. One thing that we've gotten to be very interested in lately is how those DAPs during pregnancy might be related to behaviors in early adulthood. And we're interested in delinquency and risk-taking behavior. And there's good reason for us to be interested in that in children in the Salinas Valley. We have 70% of the children at 18 years old, I should call them youth, performing any delinquent act, and a number of them had police encounters by 18 years of age. So we were concerned whether being exposed early on and during pregnancy in utero was associated with this risk-taking behavior, maybe through things like poor executive function at 18 years. And we showed that the maternal DAPs, in particular the dimethyl DAPs, and dimethyls are metabolized from organophosphates such as malathion, oxydemeton methyl, not chlorpyrifos, not diazinon, that the dimethyls in late pregnancy were related to earlier onset of juvenile delinquency by age 16 years, and also in having more delinquent events. And this was, if you look, it's like a dose response. The more delinquent events, if they had more than 6 delinquent events, they were more likely to be related to the maternal exposure to dimethyls in late pregnancy. So we're seeing that early life in utero exposure is related to a host of other neurodevelopmental and behavioral associations later on, even in early adulthood. When the children reached late adolescence, we wanted to look at functional imaging, brain imaging. However, we were in the Salinas Valley, which is remote from an academic center. And so we worked with Alan Reese at Stanford, and Sharon Sagiv in our center led this work using something called near infrared spectroscopy, or FNIRS. This is a non-invasive optical brain imaging technology. You can see the cap here that the research assistant is wearing, and these are optodes that are placed above different parts of the cortex. We specifically focused on frontal, temporal, and parietal areas. And what these optodes measure is hemodynamic changes at the cortical surface. Through different paradigms, we can actually look at cortical connectivity, but we can't really look at subcortical function. However, it is much more portable and better for field studies than an MRI, and also if anyone's claustrophobic. When the brain is working on a particular task, we see more oxygen is being used, and you can see the activity on this monitor here, whether it's green or red, depends on how much oxygen is being sensed by those optodes. What we showed is in the 15-year-olds that those mothers who lived close to organophosphate pesticide use, using the pesticide use reporting data, geospatial data, we showed decreased activation of the brain in both the left and right prefrontal lobes while the child was working on executive function tasks such as the Wisconsin card sort tasks. We saw these altered brain activation with other tasks of executive function too, such as cognitive flexibility and working memory, and this paper was published in PNAS. We've been told that Trimacos has contributed to the dramatic reduction of organophosphate pesticide use in California. You can see where we began. It was already decreasing, but supposedly we had something to do with a further decrease. And I say that because we've been told that by DPR and ag commissioners. But there are many pesticides being used in Monterey County, in the Salinas Valley. We've just focused on one. There's been an increase in change in global pesticide use worldwide, a doubling in global use over the last 3 decades. But what's changed is that we're seeing an increase in mixtures over this period of time. And so it behooved us to figure out a way to look at pesticide mixtures. Unfortunately, many of the pesticides that are used do not have biomarkers. So there's no way to measure them in the human body. But we do have that pesticide use reporting data, which we can geospatially code to the residences during pregnancy as during childhood of the children. And you can see here the dots that represent the homes during pregnancy, jiggered slightly to protect families, of relative to different pesticide exposure. We used a variety of different methods to look at mixtures. There's a bunch of different methods, statistical methods to look at mixtures. In this particular study, we're using Bayesian profile regression. And this work was led by Eric Coker, who's now in British Columbia. And here is a heat map, and you can see a bunch of different pesticides here. This is using the pesticide use reporting data, and the same pesticides here. And the darker the blue, the stronger the correlation. So you can see that pesticide use of different kinds is highly correlated because on different crops, you're using multiple different pesticides. And that's not only organophosphates such as chloropyrifos and diazinon or oxydimetron methyl, but also for some of the fungicides or the carbamates or pyrethroids or even neonicotinoids. So we see a bunch of different classes of pesticides that are highly correlated with each other. And by the way, this is full-scale IQ. Again, referring back to that 7-year IQ finding, I'm going to be talking about that again. We see negative correlation. So the higher the use, the lower the IQ. So what Eric did is he used this Bayesian profile regression to examine the associations between clusters of pesticide profiles. And he looked at, he divided each pesticide into quartiles from low to high use, and looked to see which cluster was most related to that full-scale IQ at age 7. And you can see here on this cumulative distribution plot that this cluster showed the greatest relationship with a decrease in full-scale IQ, this cluster here, and that is the cluster 1. If you look down here, that cluster is the 4th quartile of almost every single pesticide use that we examined. So it's not just organophosphates that seem to be related to our decrease in full-scale IQ, but it seems to be many different pesticides. And currently we're looking at many different kinds of methods to look at mixtures of pesticides. We have studied many other environmental exposures other than organophosphates. I mentioned pyrethroids. We've done a lot more work on that. Fungicides containing manganese, organochlorines, DDT is particularly high in our population. Fumigants such as methylbromide, glyphosate. We have a paper coming out in the next couple of weeks in EHP, and sulfur. But we've also done work on fire retardants, bisphenol A and other phenols, phthalates, other chemicals in personal care products. And as I said, Steph Holm is working on PM 2.5. The health and development of children are clearly not just determined by chemicals, they're determined by a host of many different factors. And the first one that we were concerned about were genes. And I'm going to talk about a number of these different factors. So Nina Holland and Karen Ewan in our center asked the question, are there some children by virtue of their genes, their genotype, more susceptible to organophosphate exposure? And we know that peroxidase enzyme detoxifies, metabolizes organophosphates. The amount and the efficiency of those enzymes depend on the PON1 genes that you have. And so we looked at PON1 genotypes in the mothers and the children, and also looked at peroxidase enzyme activity. And we showed that the amount of enzyme activity in the 6-month-olds, 2-year-olds, 7-year-olds compared to those in their mothers. And we showed that the levels of peroxidase grew until around 7 years of age. And it wasn't until 7 years of age that the child had similar levels of peroxidase as their adult mother, which suggests that a child until 7 years of age does not have the same ability to detoxify organophosphates. We've always known that very young children might be more susceptible, but what these data suggest is that even into middle childhood, children may be more susceptible to exposure to organophosphates. We looked at organophosphate metabolites of the mother, again, back to that 7-year IQ finding. And we said, what if the mother had high levels, low levels, moderate levels of this peroxinate enzyme? Do we see different associations with that IQ at age 7? If the mother had high maternal peroxinase during pregnancy, meaning she had higher ability to detoxify organophosphates, we see with increasing exposure, increasing DAPS, that there was no association with child IQ 7 years later. If the mother had moderate amounts of peroxinase, we see an association with IQ as you're increasing exposure based on those DAPs. But if the mother had low levels of enzyme, meaning she was less able to detoxify those organophosphates, we see a much greater impact on the IQ 7 years later, which suggests that there is a gene-environment interaction. So I said earlier that we do not see associations between postnatal exposure of the children and neurodevelopment. Most of the associations that we see with neurodevelopment are with maternal exposures during pregnancy. That picture is different when we look at other endpoints. So, for example, we've also looked at lung function and respiratory symptomatology. And in this slide, we see we're looking at the beta coefficient, 95% confidence intervals, the total DAPs in the mothers during pregnancy, the diethyls like chlorpyrifos and diazinon, the dimethyls like oxydemeton methyl, and we see absolutely no association between prenatal maternal DAPs in pregnancy and lung function at the children at age 7 years. However, the picture is different when we look at postnatal exposure to the children. There we see a clear association between the child's exposure based on the child's levels of DAPs and FEV1s and also respiratory symptomatology at age 7. So the endpoints depend on when the exposure occurred. We are currently looking at cardiometabolic measures in the Traumatis children at age 18 years. At this point, at 18 years, already about 12% of our children have metabolic syndrome, and that's comprised of these indicators. It does not include, metabolic syndrome does not include weight, BMI. But you can see that nearly the entire lion's share of our population is either overweight or obese. And we also see, sorry for the misspelling, elevated liver transaminases in nearly 15% of our population of 18-year-olds. So this is serious in terms of what this means in terms of the long-term health of those children when they reach older ages. We have a paper looking at glyphosate that is in press, looking at these outcomes, and we're working with Aicha Erkin Kakmak and Emily Pereira at looking at these outcomes in relationship to other exposures as well. So going back to this particular diagram, we talked about genes, but we're also interested in the larger environment, the psychosocial environment that these farm worker families live in. The Salinas Valley is a community where the youth are at high risk. Teen pregnancy is double the US average. We are not proud of the fact that we have had, up until I think this year, the highest youth homicide rate in California. I think this year it's Kern County, but we're up there in having the highest youth homicide rate, gang activity in California. If you look at adverse childhood events, the mothers and the children in our study have experienced many adverse childhood events. At least 50% of the mothers report at least one, and more than a quarter have reported at least 3 adverse childhood events. And by that, I mean having a family member jailed or divorce in the family, etc. And if you look at the children, even a higher proportion of them have experienced adverse childhood events. We're concerned about how these adverse events affect their health and development. And we even showed that these maternal ACEs, the ACEs of the mother during her childhood, are associated with epigenetic aging in her children. So we see this transgenerational effects of ACEs, and we also see, we haven't published this yet, the impact on the mental health of the children from the maternal ACEs. So there are transgenerational effects that are occurring. One thing that is very important for us to look at is our immigration policy on this population. As I said, at least 50 to 75% of our population is probably undocumented when we started the study. Again, we don't know. But our children are all US born. They're all US citizens. When they were 16 years old, we asked them a scale called the Perceived Immigration Policy Effect Scale, or the PIPE scale. It was developed by a Jan in Arizona for immigrants. We happened to have gone into the field in our study. We were going to at age 16, the week after the Trump election in 2016. And we immediately put into effect this PIPE scale to see how the kids were doing, because in our youth council, we had, and our youth represent the Tramacos cohort, our youth council, we had many of our kids crying after the election because of their worry about their families. So here I'm reporting on that scale of how they feel often or always. I'm not even including sometimes. And we see a quarter of the kids are worried about family separation due to deportation often or always in that post-election period. And you can see some of the other things that they're feeling as well. Again, if I added the sometimes in, we would see more than half of them are feeling concerned about the immigration policies. We show that these immigration policies, if we compare those who reported low, moderate versus high perceived immigration scores, we see that that's related to youth report of anxiety and the mother's report of their youth's anxiety level. But we also see an interference with sleep quality in the children. We do not see significant associations with maternal or child report of the youth's depression. We have also looked at studies of the mother, and in the mother, worry about deportation was associated with cardiovascular risk factors in her. So we're seeing health consequences of the U.S. immigration policy on these farm worker families, including those who put the food on our table. So the question that we asked is, what happens when we mix this pesticide exposures early on with social stresses? Do we see additional consequences? And again, I'm going back to that 7-year IQ finding. And we see that there's a double jeopardy. So looking at that 7-year IQ finding, we show that among kids with low family adversity, those DAPs, those prenatal OP DAPs in the mothers during pregnancy, was only associated with a 2.5 point decrease in IQ. Remember, I said the average was about a 6-point difference. So if you have low family adversity, only a 2.5 decrease, which was not statistically significant. But in families with high family adversity, there was a whopping 8.2 point decrease in IQ, which was very significant. Chamacos is going on. Our kids are 22 years old. We're continuing to look at social adversity. We're continuing to look at genes. We are continuing to look at epigenetics. We have 2 studies that are about to go into the field or in the field right now. Bob Gagné is following up the cohort at age 21, 22 with Steph here and John Bounds to look at respiratory symptoms, spirometry, doing mixture analysis, looking at nasal epithelium, and we're looking at PM2.5 and pesticides. We have a study, Jackie Torres, also at UCSF, following up the Chamacos mothers, looking at the relationship of early life and midlife adversity on cardiometabolic and cognitive performance. We're doing MRIs on a subsample of that maternal population. And we're also trying to figure out ways to share our data more widely. But our ultimate goal in all of our research is to reduce families' exposure to pesticides and other toxicants by acting at the individual level, the community level, and the policy level. We have formed a community advisory board that met regularly before COVID and comprised of farm workers, Chamacos participants, youth council, growers. And as a community-based participatory research project, we have educated more than 40,000 farm workers and their families on how to protect themselves from pesticide exposures. We have taught children about pesticide exposures and how to protect themselves and their parents with puppet shows. We have run community meetings to educate families. We have sent out newsletters to educate families about pesticides as well as other health endpoints. We have done studies to educate youth and also to make youth our future environmental health leaders. These studies were led by Kim Harley in our group. She does youth peer-to-peer research. This particular study, the Cosecha study, Harvest, was on pesticide exposure in the Salinas Valley community. We trained youth from the community in study design. We trained them and hired them as summer research assistants. These are high school students. And we kept them out of the fields from working because that's usually the only other employment they can have. They learned how to interview. They put wristband monitors to measure pesticides on interviewees. They collected house dust samples, and along with us, we also collected urine samples. And then after the results of the studies were determined, they actually developed radio novellas, went on radio, and they were interviewed by television, and they even went to Sacramento to report their results to policymakers.
And just a 3 or 4 minute warning.
Okay. That's before the 45 minutes, right?
That gives us 10 minutes for questions.
Okay. So we found that there are a bunch of factors associated with permethrin exposures. And one of those factors was whether the families had doormats in front of their houses. I'm not going to give you all the results of this study, but what came of that is that the kids, the interviewers, the kids that were the researchers said, well, we need to provide doormats. And this one's written in English, but it's written in Spanish on the real ones. How to reduce pesticides in their home. They handed out 1,000, we had 1,000 doormats made, and they handed out to 1,000 families in the community, doormats telling them to wipe their feet, removing their shoes, changing out of their work clothes so they wouldn't bring pesticides into their homes. We also worked with the community and an artist in the community. The kids painted this 30-foot mural. This mural is at a mall in the Salinas Valley, educating the farm workers. And as you know, mural art is very much a way a Mexican art form to educate the community about pesticide exposure and how to protect themselves against pesticide exposure. And this is in a mall in the Salinas Valley. We foster the next generation of environmental health leaders by forming this youth council of local high school and middle school students. And currently, I am working with the Cal State Monterey Bay and also the Monterey Bay Aquarium through a grant through NIH to bring science education to teachers around the environment, not just ocean health, but human health, on plastics, climate change, and pesticides. We're teaching teachers about how to teach their students about human environmental health. And we have 30 teachers from the Salinas Valley that we're actively working with even this weekend. And of course, we've contributed to local, state, national, international policy, chemical policy. But I would be amiss if we didn't talk about COVID. In a week after the shelter in place, I realized that there was a disaster that's waiting to happen in the Salinas Valley. I approached Pedro Moreno, a family practitioner, and Aaron Voigt, who was working for CRLA, California Rural Legal Assistance Program. I said, we need to write an op-ed piece. Farm workers need to be protected from COVID. They're hidden but essential workers, and nobody's thinking of them, and they're at high risk, and I'm really concerned. As a result, a week later, we established the Monterey County Coalition of Agriculture, MC-COA. We met on April 2nd. By November, we had 150 leaders from the community working to make sure that farm workers were protected and also that agriculture was protected in the community. And there were articles written about us because we brought together not only worker advocates, but also the growers, and we worked together in unison to protect agriculture and the farm workers. The growers brought together extra medical care for the farm workers. They also brought extra housing so the farm workers could be isolated. They hired they hired out hotels so that they can provide housing for isolating farm workers. In November, as a result of our effort, it became very big, and the Community Foundation for Monterey County took over, and we are now an established coalition collaborative that was established because of our efforts. We showed very early on that the farm workers in Monterey County had between 2 and 3 times higher positivity rates than other people in our county, and much higher than the general California population. And this work was led by Anna Maria Mora and Joe Leonard and myself. And we also showed that the farm workers living in multi-generational crowded housing had nowhere to shelter. And it's because of that work that the growers then provided extra housing for farm workers to shelter. We also showed that the farm workers were going to work sick. And the reasons they were going to work sick is they were concerned about losing their job, losing pay. And their employers told them they had to go to work sick. 33% were afraid of losing their jobs if they were sick with COVID. And so the growers then enacted policy to make sure that the farm workers would stay home if they were sick. We know that COVID-19 has impacted all of our lives in many ways, but it's particularly impacted the farm workers in that they were already at very low food security, but they became even lower food security. They had inability to pay bills and before, and it became even greater inability to pay their bills. And almost all of the farm workers send money back to Mexico to feed their families in Mexico, and they couldn't give those remittances to their families. Our research and efforts based at search led to California prioritizing the vaccination of farm workers in California. But it wasn't just the prioritization of farm workers in California, but many other states followed suit because of our work, which I'm very proud of, I have to say, in California, and showing that the farm workers were at high risk for developing COVID. We are currently looking with our collaborators at UC Merced at short and long COVID, and we show very high incidence of long COVID in the farm worker population. 40 to 50% of our farm workers reported long-term health problems from COVID. These are unpublished data that we're working on right now. And there was a farm worker health study survey every 20 years. It's monitored, it's funded by the CDPH, and UC Merced was awarded this. Paul Brown, Ed Flores, Anna Padilla led this work, and they showed that farm worker health in general, that farm workers are concerned about smoke inhalation during the wildfires. They're concerned about family separation. Again, very low food security. The people that are putting food on our table, 80% of them in this study of 1,500 farm workers had low or very low food security. 87% had ACEs, and 43% were obese, and nearly half of them had no health insurance. There's much more left to be done to improve the health of farm workers and families in California. But to me, COVID-19 has pulled back the curtain of what's wrong, but also what's right. The lack of affordable quality housing, the food insecurity, the irrational immigration policies, the hierarchies in the family sector where people are working against each other, but we're all should be working together because we all want agriculture to thrive in California. The lack of trust between the advocates and the growers. But I've also shown in our work with the coalition and the collaborative that we're capable of working together, and that future work could bring to the table those that are adversaries, if you will, but we're all really in this together. We continue to do our work around the world, working on environmental chemicals and children's environmental health all over the world. I've collaborated or led studies in every continent on children's environmental health except Antarctica. Maybe I'll do that one day. And I just want to say that Mark Miller and myself and a few other people, we established the International Society for Children's Health and the Environment. Anyone who's interested in protecting children worldwide from toxic chemicals are welcome to join. This is our website. We want to make sure that our message gets broadcasted throughout the world. And with that, I'd like to thank all of my collaborators. Only some of them are shown here. In particular, Asa Bradman and Kim Harley, who have worked with me tirelessly for a very long time. And also Katie Codit, who's been our study coordinator since almost the beginning. And a very special thanks to the families who have participated. This is a 12-year-old with the t-shirt we gave her when she was born. And especially to the farm workers who put the food on our table. And thank you. Please visit our website and sign up for our newsletter. Thank you.
Thanks, Brenda. That was awesome, beautiful talk. We've only got a couple of minutes for questions. If people don't step all over each other, feel free to unmute yourself and go ahead and ask a question. There were several in the chat along the way if you'd like to ask those.
I'll ask the question that I posted in the chat just now. Dr. Eskenazi, it's an honor to have experienced a lecture by you. I was wondering, you mentioned that there aren't very many biomarkers specific to many of the pesticides that are used. Since Chamacos began, have any new biomarkers been identified? And if so, have they affected the study protocol?
So the way that we collected the biosamples and the way that we stored them allows us to go get them now and measure new biomarkers. And as I said, we have a paper coming out in 2 weeks, hopefully 2 weeks, on glyphosate. And it's only recently that we've been able to measure glyphosate. It's a really tricky chemical to measure. And we've been able to measure them in the urines that we stored years ago and pull them out and measure them now. We would like to do the same thing with the neonicotinoids. So yes, you're right. As these measures are coming up, we can go back and use those 400,000 samples and measure them. And we're open to other people proposing ideas as well. If they have funding, of course, because this is not cheap. Thank you. I think someone asked if we have how many second generation. And I just want to be sure by second generation, you mean the kids of the kids, the kids of the Chamacos. And we are in this current study that Bob Gagné is starting, and our new grant, that's the cohort maintenance grant that Kim Harley is leading. We are going to be monitoring all of what I call the third generation kids, and they're going to be of very many different ages because some were the products of teenage pregnancies. We know at least a dozen teenage pregnancies in our study. So we have a substantial number of third generation, and we hope to look at the health of those children eventually too. Of course, looking at epigenetics would be really super interesting in those 3 generations.
It's our last question.
I had a question. Are you looking at PFAS chemicals in as pesticide contaminants?
It's funny you should ask that. We're doing a pilot study right now on PFASs because we're not sure that our population has very high exposure. And so we actually are pulling samples and measuring PFASs right now in a pilot study to see whether it's worth us doing. Before we use valuable samples, there are other populations that might be better to look at some of these toxicants, but it is something that we're thinking about. Of course, PFAS is best measured in blood, and blood is even more valuable for us than urine because we have swimming pools of urine, but only basically a few, milliliters of blood at each time point.
Yes, I want to let you know that your research was very helpful in Maryland and helping us work on getting a chlorpyrifos ban in the state here too. So thank you for your research. It was very useful. Thank you.
I will say, with you saying that it's interesting that we did contribute to that because the lion's share of our effects, associations, I should say, are really with the dimethyl OPs. And so we're very glad that many of those have been banned too. And when I say dimethyls, I mean like oxydimeton methyl is a big culprit. And so the whole class of OPs are problematic.
Thank you.
I'm afraid we need to stop. We're out of time, but thank you for that brilliant presentation, Brenda.